It's the end of the 2023 F1 season, which means it's time for me to rank the drivers in a tier list. Apologies for being a bit delayed with this. I caught a bit of a cold last week, so I wasn't in any condition to film anything. Feeling better now, so ready to rank these F1 drivers. So, as is tradition, I have the categories of max, standout, good, inconsistent, mid, and bad. I will go through and rank all the drivers on here, depending on their categories, and then at the end of the video, I will show you how my ranking of them has changed since the start of the year, which is something that I find quite interesting. Let's get started. First up, we have Sergio Perez, and honestly, for me, Sergio's going in bad. Yeah, it was a rough one for Sergio. Sergio won 2 races at the start of the season. And honestly, I think after 4 races, we were all really feeling like Sergio might be able to put up a title fight for the full year. But then Max just decided to turn on another gear and didn't lose any race except one for the rest of the year. And Sergio struggled so much. And in the best car in F1 history, the fact that he only got 2 wins is just unacceptable. Also the fact that he consistently didn't make Q3, but it wasn't just that. I think if Sergio had managed to finish on the podium more often and had been a respectable second driver to Max, I think I would have put him higher up. But it's the fact that he rarely finished P2 this year. His racecraft was absolutely brutal for a lot of the year. And the fact that Max ended up on the season with more than double the points that he had. He should have done so much better in that car, and it's very disappointing that he didn't. Next up is Pierre Gasly. And for me, Pierre is actually going in good. I thought that Pierre did very well for his first year at a new team. The first half of the year was a little bit rough for him, but a lot of that was team communication issues and bad luck. And I think as the season went on, he got a lot stronger. Pierre has kind of proven himself to be a very good qualifier, but would consistently get screwed over by his team strategy calls and a lack of communication. Yeah, those impeding penalties, especially I think at Spain where he got 2 in one session, was brutal. And one thing we'll see later when I get to Esteban is that I think Pierre just had less bad races than Esteban did this year. Both of them had the same number of good races, but I think Pierre had less bad races, which is surprising because I generally consider Pierre to be much more of like a peak and valley kind of driver and Esteban to be a lot more consistent, but I think this year it was almost swapped. And one thing I did notice this year with Pierre is that Alpine really seemed to favor Esteban with the strategy. Now, I don't know if it was because they actually had given Pierre what they thought had been the optimum strategy, but then it turns out that the optimum strategy was actually the strategy they gave Esteban, or if it was on purpose and they were favoring Esteban this year. But it just seemed like anytime that Gasly would qualify like P4 or P5, Esteban would be way at the back and somehow would undercut him. So I think Alpine need to do some thinking on that one. But yes, his teammate, they sure love to complain about each other on the radio. Ocon's pettiness is in his actions, Gasly's is in his words. And it makes for a very chaotic, interesting duo. So I'm excited to see where that goes next year. And then I would say for Gasly, like one of his weaknesses is his tire management. He's not as good at it at the end of his stint, and I think that's also part of the reason why he would tend to drop back during the races, while Esteban would make progress upwards. So I think that's something Gasly still has to work on. Speaking of Esteban, he's up next, and I have him in inconsistent. Esteban this year had a few absolutely incredible races, and then he had some that could only be described as embarrassing. Esteban also doesn't have the best quality pace at times. He had a lot of DNFs this year, but the vast majority of them were either a mechanical issue or a crash that wasn't his fault. And yeah, at some points this year, he seemed more concerned with what was going on with Gasly or with Alonso than playing the team game or trying to improve his own position. He's very, very petty. And it's very funny and very entertaining, but I don't know how useful it is as a attribute. All right, next up is Valtteri Bottas. And for me, Valtteri's going in mid. I think Valtteri just had a very anonymous year this year. He had a couple strong performances, and those strong performances were at a level that was above what Joe was able to reach, but really there was only a few races this year where that car was capable of anything. Valtteri was relatively close to Joe points-wise, but especially towards the end of the year, I think he still just has quite a bit more pace than his teammate, and I think Valtteri benefits a lot from experience. And speaking of, I have Zhou Guanyu just behind Valtteri. And similarly, Joe was also very anonymous this year, and I think he had a couple good races, but he just doesn't really stand out for a good or a bad reason. Next up is Nico Hülkenberg, and I have Nico in inconsistent with Esteban. This isn't really anything to do with Nico though, really. I think Nico did a fantastic job of pulling out some incredible qualifying performances in that car. And when the track was one that had low tire drag, he was able to perform. But that Haas was such a bad car that it was really tough to tell how well Nico was actually driving in it, because it would just fall back in the race and you couldn't do anything about it. So it's just tough to tell what he was really doing in that car. So Kevin, unfortunately, Kevin is going in bad. He was just nowhere all year and just consistently out-qualified by his teammate, didn't really have any standout performances. Next up, we have Alex Albon, and Albano is my first driver going into standout. Albon impressed me so much in 2023. On weekends where the Williams car was actually good, he was able to capitalize almost every single time. The only race he didn't, which was his worst performance of the year, was Australia. Logan, on the other hand, is my worst driver of the year. He's going in the bad category. He was just significantly outperformed by Albon and won this year's Destructors Championship because he crashed a lot. And yeah, he just barely held on to his fifth one seat. I think if he is obliterated again by Alex, then I think he's done. Next up is AlphaTauri, and Yuki Sonoda, I'm putting in good, just ahead of his former teammate. This might be a bit high compared to other people, but I think with the amount of things that Yuki had to deal with at that team this year, I think he did a very good job. He had to become a team leader after Pierre left and managed to destroy De Vries' career. He was on about the same level as Liam Lawson, and then I would say slightly outperformed Daniel Ricciardo, although Daniel did have a lot of things going on for him too, which we'll get to later. Honestly, I do think that Yuki saved his F1 seat this year. As he gets more and more comfortable in F1, I think he's only going to get better. But yes, like either outperformed or similar level to all three of his teammates this year. And so the fact that he was able to make his way through all that turmoil was very impressive. Okay, next up, it's my boy. It's Daniel Ricciardo. He's going in inconsistent behind Nico. I am a Daniel girly. You all know this. But even I have to be honest, and I think Daniel had a lot of things go against him this year, but Mexico was his only really good performance. I don't really feel like we had enough data points to really analyze how he's doing. I think he was a little bit rusty and maybe a bit out of shape after his injury, which is just unfortunate. And I honestly just feel like he didn't have enough races to really show what he can do at this point in his career. But I feel like all of his races were better than 90% of his time at McLaren. So I think he's on the up and up. I think he's not as washed of a driver as some people think he is, but I think Daniel just needs a standard full F1 season to show everybody what he's got. Okay, next up I have my other boy. It's Charles Leclerc, and he's going in standout right behind Alex Albon. Now, the reason why I have him behind Alex is I do think that Charles made a few more mistakes this year than Alex did. And I think what Alex was able to do in as terrible a car as the Williams is, I think was just a little bit more impressive to me than what Charles was able to do in that Ferrari. But I think towards the end of the year, it definitely got close, and it was a very close toss-up between these two for me. But yes, Charles had a really tough start to the year with his typical bad luck. But at the end of the year, once they had upgraded the car and it was a podium contender, he performed incredibly well. I think he still has a few mistakes to iron out. I don't think anyone can beat Charles in terms of qualifying pace. If he eventually gets a car that is on his level, the world better watch out, because he's going to be a dangerous, dangerous man. Carlos, I have in good this year, ahead of Yuki. I think Carlos outperformed Charles at the start of the year when the car wasn't that good, but it suited Carlos's style because Carlos likes a bit more understeer in his car. Carlos definitely had a stretch of really good performances in the middle of the season, in particular Monza and Singapore. But as soon as the car got better and became a consistent podium contender, Charles started to outperform him consistently. Yeah, once the car is good, Carlos just can't keep up with Charles. Next up, I have Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis is going in standout. I think it's just so impressive that Lewis still managed to do well in a car that was just so bad, and a car that he just absolutely hated to drive, and yet still finished P3 ahead of that big clump of drivers that were only 5 points apart. I think it just shows you how good of a driver Lewis is that he finished P3 ahead of that Ferrari, which I would say was probably the second best car, because they just had a lot more really good performances this year than the Mercedes. I think Mercedes were a very consistent car throughout the year, but I think other teams, when they were in their window, would outperform the Mercedes and then drop below the Mercedes in other races. There were only a few races this year where I would say the Merc was the second best car. But I do have Lewis lower than a few other drivers that I'll get to later, mainly just because I feel like Lewis had a few more weak races this year than in previous seasons. Usually he's very good at being consistent all year, although I think part of that is the fact that since he didn't have a championship winning car, he didn't need to be as consistent as he usually is, and he was kind of locked into that P3 position, and it wasn't really much he was really working towards, especially at the end of the year. And he finished in the points in every single race that he finished, which I think is he's the only driver to do that this year, apart from Max. But in terms of comparison to his teammate, he was equal to George on qualifying, but significantly outperformed him in the races, got way more good results, way more points, and yeah, George was struggling this year. And speaking of, I have him an inconsistent, just ahead of Bestie. Honestly, for George, I really could not tell you a single race this year where he had a very standout performance in a good way. He was just very invisible this year, apart from the odd, extremely funny radio message. George Russell has become a living meme, and he's not my favorite driver, but I can definitely appreciate that aspect of him. And he did have several bad races this year due to mistakes that cost him quite a bit of points. And I think that's probably why he finished so far behind his teammate this year. And George is also generally fairly consistent, but it's at a lower level of consistent than Lewis. And yeah, just his race pace this year wasn't there compared to Lewis. So something he needs to improve on, especially if the Mercedes gets better. Okay, next up we've got the Aston Martin guys. And Fernando Alonso is going in standout just ahead of Lewis. For me, the reason why I have Fernando ahead of Lewis is just that I think Fernando didn't really have any bad races this year. He had a few races where he wasn't as good as normal, but he never had like a truly bad performance, and I think for that reason he is a little bit ahead of Lewis. And also the fact that he was able to do this in the fifth best car, compared to the second best car is quite impressive. But yeah, Fernando started the year off incredibly strong and then finished the year quite well, but the middle section was a bit off, but that was more so because of the car kind of getting away from them than anything else. He always outperforms the car he's driving. I don't think there has been a year where Fernando has underperformed the car. Compared to his teammate Lance, he just completely destroyed Lance. That team had 2 good drivers in it this year. They would have finished a lot higher than P5, and Lance definitely let them down, which is why I have Lance in mid ahead of the 2 Alfa Romeos. I probably would have had him much lower, probably in bad behind Checo Perez, but at the very end of the year, he managed to turn it around just enough where I'm like, okay, I'll put you in mid. I think Lance seems to perform well when the car is good, but when the car isn't good, he just isn't able to get anything out of it. And that mainly comes in qualifying. He has just never been a good driver in qualifying. It just consistently lets him down, because if you look at him in the races, I was looking at a stat today, he was actually the 2nd best driver this year at making up positions in races. And I think part of this is just that since he qualifies below what the car is capable of, he's able to bring it up in the races. And he is a good driver in the race. It's something I've said it a lot, like his biggest strength is his race starts. He knows where to place the car to make up positions and not get into trouble. And he's good at bringing that car up through the race. But if he was able to qualify better, he would be a much better driver, but he's just not. And so he's always able to make up positions, but if you're starting from P16 and you're only able to make up 5 positions, you're still not getting in the points. So even if he was just good enough to qualify in that like P11 to P13 range, I think he would be able to get a lot more points, but it's just the fact that he's getting kicked out in Q1 in a good car. It's like, what are you doing, buddy? You got to be better than that. But yes, towards the end of the year, he was able to qualify better, and then he was able to get those P5, P6 finishes that he should have been getting all year. So he's just a very frustrating driver for me. But yeah, I will say, I think a big reason why I have him down in mid is that he just wasn't able to do what Fernando was able to do in that car. And I think if he was, that Aston Martin would have been able to definitely get P4, but I think probably should have maybe even gotten P3 this year. So it's just unfortunate that Lance wasn't able to get very much out of the car. But yeah, Fernando just completely obliterated him. And the only times he really beat him was when Fernando's car had damage or the team made a mistake. Okay, next up we have Oscar Piastri. And I hummed and hawed with Oscar, but for me, I think I'm going to put him in good ahead of Carlos Sainz. Oscar had a truly incredible rookie year. He didn't make too many big mistakes. The only one I can really think of is him crashing and qualifying in Canada. There were some races where he's able to be on Lando's level, especially in the first few races when that McLaren car got good. He won that sprint race in Qatar, and then Lando just flipped a switch and Oscar was no longer near Lando in terms of pace. So I think Lando got kicked into high gear because of that. And I think he was also going to tracks that he wasn't as familiar with, and that might have cost him as well. I will say though that Oscar does have a lot to learn in terms of tire management, and once he figures that out, I think he will be a very powerful driver, and I'm very curious to see where his career goes from here. He is just so emotionally mature and keeps calm under pressure. I think he's much better at this than a lot of drivers on the grid, and for a rookie, I think that's very impressive. And when the car was good, he performed. He didn't make mistakes in qualifying like someone else in an orange car. Speaking of Lando, I have him in standout just behind Fernando and Lewis. I think it's truly a toss-up between those three. The reason why I have Lando behind Fernando and Lewis is just that Lando kept making massive mistakes in qualifying sessions when the car was good. When he knew that he could put it on pole, or when he knew he could be on for a very good result in the race, he kept pushing it a little bit too hard in qualifying and getting caught out on track limits or having a big moment, and it just cost him so much. But yeah, compared to his teammate, he outperformed him in qualifying and had much better race pace, mainly due to knowing how to manage his tires. But I think Oscar did seem to outperform him in high pressure situations on tracks where that car was good for the most part, but only really in qualifying. Once the race came around, even if Lando had qualified below Oscar, I'd still pass him in the race eventually, but I think he would have done a lot better if he had qualified higher. And finally, our number one driver of the year. Is it really any surprise? It's Max Verstappen. If anyone doesn't have him as the best driver of the year, they are completely delulu. I don't know what else to say. Y'all know I am a Max hater, but even I know when to respect someone for their talent, and Max just had an incredible season. He was completely unstoppable, and he won every single race this year except 3. And set way too many records to count, and took a record away from Seb, which hurt me in my heart. But Seb will still always be the youngest driver champion, and so that I can still take solace in. He is the best driver in the wet. He's the most aggressive driver. He has very quick pace in qualifying. I wouldn't necessarily say the best, but he has very quick pace in qualifying. He has probably the quickest race pace. He's the best in the best team in terms of strategy. He's in the best team in terms of pit stops. Although maybe second best now thanks to McLaren's 1.8 second pit stop, but it's very debatable between those two teams. And then he also has the best team in car design because of Adrian Newey. So those last 3 aren't really Max, but still, there is no weakness. What is the weakness? I do not know. 0 weaknesses there. I am very, very curious to see what happens if someone else can get back on Max's level, because I think if we can put Max under a little bit more pressure than he's been under, maybe we will see him not be as dominant as he has been this year, because no one was able to put him under pressure, and so no one was able to get under his skin. Things are looking a little bit better for next year, and I'm really, really hoping that the teams don't screw it up. But I think Red Bull also has the chance to really make a huge step themselves, and so I don't know. As you can probably tell, I've been very unmotivated at the end of this year. I've been putting out videos like a week after I should be, and it hasn't been very good for growing my follower count, but the big reason for that is just that F1 isn't as fun when there isn't competition. And I'm really hoping that comes back next year. I really need it. I think if there was another season like this one, I might have to put a pause on this channel for a little bit until things kind of turn around again, because I don't want to burn myself out doing this when I'm not enjoying it. But yeah, here's to Max having the most dominant season in F1 history. I applaud you for your talent and your efforts, sir. Please never do it again. I think a lot of the F1 world would appreciate that. But if you do manage to do it again, all the more to you. I will be complaining the entire time. That's where I'm at. It's now almost 2 a.m. and I'm filming this video because I've been talking for almost 2 hours. So I need to stop, and this will be clipped in a way to hopefully not be so long, but I just had a lot to say about all of these drivers. So overall, here is my list of drivers from 1st to 20th in terms of how they did this season. I think the biggest movers, Sonoda was up 11 places from the start of this year, and then Albon and Piastri made up a lot, as well as Hülkenberg. Biggest droppers, definitely Perez, who is lucky to still have a seat, honestly. That's kind of how I'm feeling about it. And Magnussen as well really dropped, but I think that was partially the Haas's fault, and Russell really dropped as well. I think he just didn't really have a very impressive season. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how I rank them going into next year, because there is no changes from this list for the 2024 F1 drivers. So I think how I rank them as drivers is different than this, but then how a season goes does change their ranking. So it'll probably be a clean slate going into next year, and things will move around a little bit. So that's the end of this video. Give a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I'm going to try to put out more content in the off season, but as I have said, I have been woefully unmotivated lately. And as soon as I promise what videos will be out, I no longer make those videos. So that's ADHD for you. Sometimes you can't win. Let me know what your rankings were in the comments down below, and I hope you enjoy the holiday season if you don't hear from me again. Toodaloos.